Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work as I just kind of process through the text for the week over the course of the week. That's kind of the first take. Wow, I can't talk today. To go out of that mode that I just fumbled through a second ago and move into the mode of writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason for doing these videos. Then the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason, to gain some different insight into the gospel text for the week. So that's kind of why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is July 17th, the ninth Sunday after Pentecost here in 2016. Our gospel lesson comes out of Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. This is a very brief passage. It kind of continues directly after last week's gospel, which was the parable of the Good Samaritan. That directly precedes this and is coming into it. Now, if you recall, if you've been a regular viewer and you've seen the last few weeks worth of videos, we see that in chapter 9 of Luke's gospel, Jesus has turned his face towards Jerusalem. His ministry is still ongoing. It takes him a long time to get there. It's not until chapter 19 that Jesus actually finally rides the donkey into Jerusalem, but his face is turned towards Jerusalem. So everything he's doing is pointed that direction, and not necessarily from a logistical standpoint, because it kind of seems like he does a lot of wandering in various directions before finally actually getting into the region. But everything is going that general way from the standpoint of Jesus knows that that's where this is going to end. That's where this is all going to culminate. And it's for a specific reason. So everything is kind of geared in that direction. Now we hear just a little tiny bit of traveling. It opens with now as they were on their way, and that's kind of what they're talking about. They're still moving around towards Jerusalem. This passage does not tell us which village that they're in, but we do hear in this brief passage that he's into the home of Martha, Sister Mary, which we know from John's gospel that their home is in Bethany. At least that's where John records that it is. Now, Bethany itself is only a couple of miles away from Jerusalem, which is a little odd. Because, as I said, we're only in chapter 10 here. He doesn't get to Jerusalem until chapter 19, or into the vicinity even, until 18, when he comes into Jericho, which is also in that neck of the woods. And so it's a little bit strange. It raises the question, is this encounter perhaps just a different telling, a little different perspective upon the meal that occurs during the final week of Jesus' life, before his crucifixion, in Bethany, in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who's their brother, not named here, but in that instance, when Jesus' feet are anointed, it's by Mary, the sister, and so there are some similarities between this passage that I'm about to read here in Luke and that one from John. Very different places in terms of timeline from Luke to John, if they are in fact the same event. But I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that's a possibility, and that when the author of Luke was writing it, he put it here as opposed to later on in where we see it in John. But they could be two different events as well. And it's possible that Mary and Martha, named here in Luke, are a different set of sisters. Again, we don't hear about Lazarus. Mary and Martha were two very common female names in Jesus' time, Mary especially. And in fact, we hear about countless Marys throughout the different Gospels. So it's possible that they are two completely different stories, and that they are even two different sets of sisters. That's certainly possible. But regardless of all of that kind of background stuff, how about we dive in? So again, Jesus has just finished telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. and the encounter with the expert in the law about who is my neighbor, and neighbors are the ones who show mercy. Neighbors are the ones who receive mercy. And how are we neighbors for one another? And he tells them, go and do likewise. Interesting that that then is that leads right into this story. So, okay, I'm going to dive in and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her. Okay, so that's it. It's a very brief passage, not a whole lot in terms of length. But so remember, I mentioned that we just heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the sort of moral application that I talked about last week, if you happen to hear it, of how we are called to care. We are called to do service for those who need it. So that has just happened. And Jesus tells the guy, go do likewise. And then we hear about this. And Martha is doing what's expected of her. But then at the same time, Martha is considered to be the biblical busybody because she's bouncing off the walls doing perhaps too much. She's the host or the hostess, and as such, she is apparently she's preparing food. She's perhaps cleaning. She's just doing many different things, so much that she's distracted. Perhaps she's not doing any of them well because she's trying to do 10 things at once, or perhaps she's just running around like a chicken with her head cut off because she's trying to do so much. And at the same time that all this is going on, her younger sister, who may or may not live with her, not that really matters, but her younger sister shirks the work which would be expected of the women, and goes in and sits at the feet of Jesus like one of his disciples to listen to him, which women would not do. They wouldn't. It just was odd that she would have done this, and yet that's what Jesus praises. Now, what's interesting in this story is all too often we kind of tend to make it a competition. Like Martha did the wrong thing, and Mary did the right thing. And so what this is saying, if we just look at this passage, is that the only thing that we are called to do is sit and listen to Jesus. And now that's important. I'm not saying it's not. And like Jesus says, Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. That time spent with Jesus cannot be taken away. What we learn from Jesus cannot be taken away from us. It builds our life of faith. It strengthens our faith, this time that we spend listening to the words of Christ, whether in Mary's case, literally at his feet, or in our case, during quiet time of reflection, time spent in the Word, many different ways of doing that cannot be taken away from us. That's kind of the sort of moral application, but yet we just heard Jesus say, be a servant, go and serve those in need. And Jesus says, I come among you as one who serves, and you are called to do likewise. And so it's kind of like, as we think about what Martha's doing, what she's doing is not bad. And perhaps she's trying to do too much, and she's distracted by that. And that's what Jesus is kind of calling out gently. It's not a harsh rebuke, but there's kind of a gentle rebuke that's in there. But what's interesting as I think about this, and I'm going into the Greek, that it says Martha was distracted by her many tasks. The Greek word, or the Greek base word for tasks, is a word that's diakonia, kind of a big fancy word that got thrown around when I was in seminary a lot. But it basically means service or ministry. So a way that we could say this is that Martha was distracted by her many ministries that she was trying to do. And what's that mean? What's that mean for us? And I was thinking about that. And in the church, do we oftentimes get so bogged down with trying to do too much, that we miss the opportunities to sit at the feet of our Lord? Do we try to do so much that we don't do any of them well? That we try and do so much that we're dropping the ball on other things that could be done? And I think that's a possible application for this, and something for us to consider. It's we in the church can do a lot of things halfway, or we can do a few things well. And it's a good reminder for us that as we are given gifts by the Spirit, and called to use them, focus on that, and don't try and do too much. If in Martha's case, if she was making a huge meal when maybe something very simple would have sufficed. You can make a 5-course banquet, or you can make me a sandwich. Or she's trying to clean the entire house when maybe all you needed to do was pick a cloak up off the chair so Jesus could sit down. It's a lot of possible speculative type ways that we could think about this. But what I find to be interesting in this, and what kind of the direction I think I'm going to go with the sermon is, Jesus gently rebukes Martha, telling her, you are focused on many things. Only one thing is needed. And that's kind of where I get the notion of just make me a sandwich. But perhaps he's calling her to come into Sabbath. And maybe that's what Mary's doing. Mary is taking time to have Sabbath. And Sabbath isn't just, hey, Sunday, you can't do any work and you have to sit and read your Bible for 17 hours. It's how do we spend time with the Lord? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Sometimes it is time spent in the Word. Sometimes it's simply sitting and being and having a moment of silence. Or sometimes it's looking and finding joy with the people that you are with, and recognizing that joy of relationship comes from that. And another pastor I know said something that's really resonated with me at times. It's, think about when you're hanging out with your buddies, and it's like, hey, what do you want to do? I don't know. Let's just kind of sit and hang out. And do we do that with Jesus? And he put it like this. He says, so Jesus, what do you want to do? I don't know. Let's just sit here and have coffee. And so I think about that notion. And is that what Jesus is calling Martha into in this moment? Offering a little bit of a corrective, reminding her of the importance not only of service, but also of time to sit at the feet of our Lord, and to be in that time together, because that cannot be taken away. That relationship cannot be taken away from us. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about in terms of the sermon, the direction that I think I'm going to go in light of this brief passage. But the reminder that it's not a competition. It's not that Mary did it right and Martha did it wrong. But that God desires that time with us. God desires that relationship with us. And maybe our identity is not in how we approach God, in how we choose to spend our time, how we choose to do our ministry, or how we choose to do our acts of service, but that our identity is in one that God, that the Lord chooses to come to. That it's not about us, it's about what God chooses to do out of love for us. And that our identity is one that Jesus will call by name, not even once, but twice in the case of Martha, to get her attention. And we don't know what happens in the aftermath of this, because at the end of this, it starts a new chapter in the narrative and it's on to a different story. But I kind of like to think that maybe Martha took off her apron and set down her broom and came and pulled up a chair next to Mary, and just to spend time with the Lord. And likewise, we are called to do the same. We're empowered to do the same. So that's kind of what's happening in this brief passage. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, share those down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.